Welcome to this video about the basics of engine failure gliding for air traffic controllers. For the record, I'm filming this on January 24th of 2021, so let's get started. So really just how well do airplanes glide? Before we jump into too much detail, throw a little bit of math, a few numbers at you, but then we're going to greatly simplify this by the time we get to the end of this video. Let me start off by pointing to a recent video with 3 different clips. Let me give you a little bit of backstory about what we're going to look at. If you go to the website here, as I have it, as I'm filming this on January 24th, it's still very messy and very much under construction. However, on the case studies and simulations page, one of the case study videos I've already done concerned the 2018 crash of Beech Bonanza 207 Papa Charlie, ended up in trees somewhere east of Seattle. It turns out that coincidentally, about 2 weeks after shooting my video, there's a fantastic guy down in Texas near the Dallas area named Scott Perdue. He has a YouTube channel called Flywire. He posted an excellent YouTube video about that same incident. And by the way, Scott is something of a specialist on emergencies in Bonanzas. It's unfair to pigeonhole him that much, but that's among his many talents. Then it turns out about 2 weeks after that, so a month after I made my case study video, he posted an interview with the controller who was involved in that incident, put it up on his own YouTube channel, completely independent of me. I had no idea that was coming and so on. That was just a few days ago. And so I had this video that was already in production, and I was able to kind of make some changes to the first part of it that are absolutely perfect. So beautiful serendipity. I'm not ashamed to take advantage of it. So let's watch 3 clips from that interview where Scott Perdue was interviewing the now retired controller who helped that Bonanza pilot out back in 2018. So here's the first clip.
Hey, I got a real treat for you today. We're going to talk to the air traffic controller that worked 207 Papa Charlie on the engine out in the mountains in IMC. And it all worked out really well, so stick with us on Flywire.
All right, since none of us like F-15s and so on. Okay, even though they're kind of cool. All right, clip number 2. Here we're going to start to get into about 25 seconds of some of the meat of the discussion.
Engine out in a Bonanza, especially an 836, is probably about 1,500 feet per minute.
Yeah, I had no idea. And I'll tell you, Scott, when this happened, I thought, he's at 11,000 feet. We got nothing but time. We would get him anywhere. And being not a pilot, I was wrong, but I can't believe how fast that airplane came down. I mean, it's a Dutch airplane. It's probably pretty damn.
Okay, I'm going to stop that one there. Just Ken is now talking about the fact that he was surprised by how quickly he came down. And then for the third clip, let's watch. This one's going to be a little bit longer. It'll be about 3 minutes here.
I did, yeah. I just thought maybe some pilots and controllers could learn something from it. I'm not a pilot, so.
Yeah, I understand, and I think you're absolutely right. I think both pilots, it is an excellent example to learn from for both pilots and controllers. Yeah. You know, and not a hit on you, and you're not a pilot, but a lot of controllers that I hear in emergencies, they're actually saying things that they think are well-meaning, but
right.
They don't actually help the situation out.
Exactly. And I wish I would have used the words best glide speed, even though he did that already. And I wish I would have said flaps. You know, you can Monday morning quarterback this to death.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the FAA does not do a great job, in my opinion. I don't want to get arrested, but they don't teach that shit. I remember going through my training and thinking, I don't even know how to fly an airplane. Shouldn't I know some basics?
Yeah.
It never came. So.
Never came up. Yeah.
You should get a contract with the FAA and be a contractor to teach controllers how to help pilots.
help introduce pilots to controllers into what pilots do.
Yeah, I mean, you can laugh about it, but it'd be a valuable tool. You know,
I think it would be an excellent experience.
Because when that happens, when things go down the shitter, we're calling for the guy that's in the break room that is a pilot. You know. Get him in here. We need some, let him talk to this guy, because I'm not a pilot,
Yeah.
So a little base of knowledge, just a base. I don't need to be a pilot, but a little basic knowledge would be, I think, extremely helpful.
Extremely helpful. Yeah, I totally agree. Plus, I think
I'm going to stop it there. all I'm looking for here is just giving everybody a base of knowledge because this isn't taught. And for what it's worth, in one of these engine failure situations, if the guy's going to come down from 11,000 feet at 1,500 feet a minute, if I'm in the break room when you page me, by the time I put my sandwich down, get into the control room, try to get up to speed, this guy's on short final, so good luck on that. You're going to have to do it kind of on your own. Sorry, it's not that I'm lazy, it's just I'm in the middle of eating a sandwich. Okay, having said that, let's get serious and let's actually jump into some of the specifics. I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you to kind of justify a very simplistic number at the end. For those of you who want to cheat and just skip to the end of the video, you can go to it, but you're not going to understand how I'm getting to that number and why I want controllers to do just a tiny bit of this math in the real world, because where I'm going with this is I'm going to give you kind of one simple number to start with, but then because every situation is unique, you're going to have to see how well that airplane is performing in that individual case. All right, so let's jump into all this. So first of all, there are different ways that manufacturers express what's known as the glide ratio. There's no regulatory standard to how this has to be expressed. In fact, as far as I'm aware, there's no actual requirement in the regs for manufacturers to publish that. I could be wrong about that. Having said that, some manufacturers in their pilot operating handbooks or airplane flying manuals will express it as a direct ratio of distance forward to distance down. So for example, somebody might publish that such and such airplane has a 10-to-1 glide ratio. It can go 10 feet forward for every foot down. It can go 10 nautical miles forward for every 1 nautical mile up, basically 6,000 feet above the terrain. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Some will express it as a distance forward in miles, typically nautical miles. It can be statute miles, but they'll express it as a distance forward in miles per 1,000 feet of altitude loss. Again, if you think about it, it's basically just a ratio of forward to how much you're coming down, right? So, for example, some manufacturers will publish that their airplane glides, if you operate it properly, at about 1.7 nautical miles per 1,000 feet. That's a roughly typical value for some airplanes. Okay, some of them will publish a graph, and I'll show you an example of this in a moment, but just plotting altitude above the terrain or above ground level on the y-axis and then distance traveled forward on the x-axis. Manufacturers could publish it as an angular amount. So, for example, they could say that in an engine failure situation, the airplane glides downward at a 7-degree downward glide angle. Nobody publishes that. That would actually be a fairly realistic real-world value, and we'll come back to that later in this video. But nobody publishes that I'm aware of. There's kind of no reason, even though I have one particular reason for using that later that you don't need to worry about too much. You also could do it, and for the record, nobody publishes it this way, but this is the number I'm going to want controllers to calculate live during emergencies. It is bone simple to do, but it's going to be altitude lost per nautical mile traveled. It's basically the same as that second one where you're expressing distance forward per altitude lost, and we're just sort of flip-flopping it. So we're looking at per mile. So let me just touch on how you would calculate this one. So let's say somebody starts at 15 miles out when you first have a chance to kind of write down their altitude, okay? So 15 miles out and they're at whatever altitude. Just write down the distance to the airport they're heading for and that altitude. All right. And for the sake of discussion, let's make it real simple. Let's just call it 10,000 feet, okay? And I'm just going to make the mental math real easy. So let's assume somebody's losing 1,000 feet per nautical mile. So 15 miles, 10,000 feet. Well, when they get to 14 miles, you're 1 mile from where you first wrote it down. Just note the altitude. And in this case, they're at 9,000 feet. Okay, well, you've only had 1 mile to kind of assess it, but it looks like they're losing about 1,000 feet per mile. Well, 13 miles, you look at it, it's 8,000 feet. Again, and then you kind of average that out, and you can very quickly, over just a couple of miles, once you get started on this, have a fairly good feel for how fast the airplane is descending. And again, no manufacturer publishes that. That becomes useful because, again, let's go back to our example. Is that airplane going to make it to the airport? Well, by the time you've done a couple of these, now the airplane's coming up on 10 miles and they're losing 1,000 feet per mile. Well, they've got 10 miles to go. They're losing 1,000 feet per mile and the airplane's only at 7,000 feet. I'm sorry, unless the airport's 3,000 feet below sea level, they ain't going to make it. You might as well find a diplomatic way to tell them that, listen, pilot person, you ain't going to make it. Say intentions. You can be a little more diplomatic than that, but that's actually something that I want us to calculate that. I'll give you kind of a quick guess on what that'll be for typical aircraft later on in this video, but you'll always want to look at what's actually being achieved. Okay, just a couple of examples of what these look like. This is an airplane flight manual for a Diamond DA-40. Don't worry about the different airspeeds and things like that for different weights. We'll cover that in a separate video. But the note here says that the glide ratio, and Diamond prefers to express it kind of two ways. They're just equivalent ways of doing it. So they can express it as the glide ratio is 8.8 to 1, i.e. for every 1,000 feet of altitude loss, the maximum horizontal distance traveled in still air is 1.45 nautical miles. Those are just two different ways of expressing the exact same thing. And by the way, during this time, the propeller will continue to windmill. This is one from a Cirrus turbocharged 206. Again, don't worry about the details and so on. I will note flaps up, zero wind. These things are all going to say zero wind. We will talk about how to adjust for wind in a separate video. We'll also talk about how to adjust for weight in a separate video. For the moment, just kind of ignore those. But on a graph like this, what I would do is the easiest way for me to calculate the glide ratio when I look at these things, and I've looked at dozens and dozens of these, just keep in mind that 1 nautical mile is just a tick over 6,000 feet, call it 6,100. And just to kind of get my values a little more precise, I generally will kind of double that. So I round up to 6,100, double it to 12,200, and I'll just mentally draw a line across at 12,200. Bring it on down. For this Turbo 206, it looks like it's about 17.4. Don't forget, that's the distance per 2 miles up. Okay, and so that's a ratio after you divide that 17.4 by 2 of about an 8.7 to 1 ratio. Yeah, pretty darn close to that DA-40 we were looking at a minute ago, although that's a bit more coincidence rather than anything else. But you will find a lot of airplanes that are single-engine G airplanes that cluster somewhere about a 9 to 1 glide ratio. That's actually a fairly typical value for a lot of these airplanes. Okay, I put together a spreadsheet that has sample performance numbers that come in a variety of formats, and I tried to get it into a graph that was going to kind of mimic that Cessna one you saw a second ago, but have a bunch of different airplanes up there. You can be the judge about the aesthetics, but don't be too harsh on me, and we're going to throw out the high and the low scores when we remember that there's a degree of difficulty on this one. The point that I'm trying to make in this one is these are sorted from upper left, kind of going across, and then the second line, and then the third line by glide ratio performance. And I've got it plotted as if we're trying to figure out how high they would have to start if they were going to try to glide 20 miles. So unsurprisingly, the highest performer out of all these is the one in purple. This is the Pipistrel Virus LSA motor glider, and you can feather the propeller. So you can shut the engine off, feather propeller, and it's designed basically to be a glider with a self-launching motor. Unsurprisingly, it glides pretty good, so it's relatively flat, so to speak. Okay, the two jets that I happen to put in the spreadsheet, one is some published numbers I was able to obtain for an Airbus A350, and the other one, actually that line should be red, for the actual glide performance that Sully and Skiles got in the steady state situation before they deployed flaps when they got down to about 400 AGL. They were doing about a 19 to 1 glide ratio. I've put those in red, although oversight, that's supposed to be red, it's not. In green, solid lines, I have some single-engine turboprops, Cessna Caravan, and that's with the cargo pod, the TBM 930, and the Pilatus PC-12. Those all glide fairly well. The Baron G58, I've got it in green, and I'll explain why in just a minute. I have put it in a dashed line because it is a piston-powered airplane instead of a turboprop like these are, okay? And then notice a huge variety of single-engine piston-powered aircraft glide from top to bottom. That SR-22, which is basically the worst, that's actually the turbo one there, but the normally aspirated is virtually the same. 182, 206, DA-40, 172, Bonanza A-36, the Columbia 350 or Cessna 350, I've kind of just clumped those together as a C-350. Diamond DA-20, and then some of the very high-performance gliders among the airplane piston singles, Piper Malibu Matrix type airplanes, and the Mooney M20R Ovation 3, for example. But anyway, you can see that there's definitely a disparity. So how are we going to simplify this? Well, first of all, I want to note a couple things. So the piston singles, and this is usually who we are thinking about when it comes to an engine failure situation, they're going to be anywhere from about an 8 to 1 glide ratio for the worst worst performing ones. Nothing against a Cirrus, it happens to be the worst one here. Roughly an 8-to-1 up to about a 12-to-1 glide ratio. But I want you to take note of the fact that these airplanes all have something in common. They cannot feather their propellers. Now, some of these have controllable pitch propellers or constant speed props, and in an engine failure situation, pilots are advised to take the propeller control, if they have one, and bring it to the low RPM, which is the high pitch position, and that gets the propellers as close to being feathered as they can, where they would be kind of edge on to the airflow and so on. But here's what happens. These airplanes, even though some of them can manipulate the propellers somewhat, they can't feather the propellers, and that is probably one of the biggest factors in why they don't glide so well. And frankly, I'm not absolutely 110% certain about this. I think that the reason why the Cirrus aircraft happen to be among the worst gliders is because they have a constant speed prop. However, they don't have an independent propeller control. So in effect, when they have an engine failure, there is no way for the pilot to bring the propeller to that low RPM or high pitch position, and so they have a lot of propeller drag, and that's why I think the Cirrus is one of the worst gliders. One of the takeaways for that is that whenever we're working an airplane that has an oil pressure problem and one of these constant speed props, the pilot can move that lever all they want. The way most of these propellers work, the vast majority, it takes oil pressure to manipulate those blades and drive them to that high pitch position. And so some of these pilots, I think, are going to have an engine failure, and they think they're in a relatively good gliding airplane. For example, I know this is for the A36 here, but that B36TC that ended up in the trees outside of Seattle back in 2018, that pilot would have reasonably expected he had one of the better performing airplanes. However, his particular failure involved a total loss of oil pressure. Even if he pulled the prop lever back, which I think he did, I'm not positive, guess what? He was in one of the worst performing ones, so your mileage will always vary. But anyway, piston singles, typically about an 8-to-1 to about a 12-to-1 glide ratio. We're just going to touch on this very quickly. The Baron, because all of these piston twins, and I would expect most of the piston twins are going to glide more or less like the Baron, and that is pretty good because the piston twins, they can feather the props, because if you lose one engine, you absolutely got to feather that prop because it has so much drag if you don't. So they can feather the props. If they have a dual engine failure, they can feather both props. Now keep in mind that assumes they have oil pressure and so on. But basically, a Baron or an Aztec or something like that that has both engines shut off and not some oil pressure problem, they're going to glide well. And these turbine airplanes, they feather the props typically. Certainly all the Pratt & Whitney PT6s, which is what drives the 208s, the TBMs, the Pilatus PC12s, and so on. And because those propellers feather, plus some other things, they glide really well. The jets tend to be very good gliders. Glide ratios on the order of 15-to-1 to somewhere around 20-to-1. Good luck finding the propellers. So that's part of the reason why. That's not the sole reason, but that's actually one of the oversimplified ways you can think about it. Not that we're hopefully having to deal with too many commercial jets with dual engine failures. All right. So let me kind of simplify this a little bit and just focus on the piston singles and give you some recommended ATC initial guesses. And I've got kind of three guesses here. Let me start with the line that's in the green here. That 9-to-1 average book value. So if you read the book and it says, pilots, if you fly the airplane at the right speed, you move your propeller control where you should leave the gear up if it's retractable gear. You maybe do a couple other things with some of these airplanes. If you glide it the way you're supposed to, again, there's a huge variety, but typically we're looking at something like a 9-to-1 glide ratio. So that is, there are airplanes that are going to do better than that. You can see, for example, that some of these will do better. Okay, this one down here is for that Mooney and Matrix, the PA-46. But some of them will do better than that, but that's actually kind of a decent average. 8-to-1 is kind of what I'm calling a real-world estimate, assuming that there's not some kind of problem. So the problem could be loss of oil pressure, maybe something else, and they're going to glide particularly poorly. But that 8-to-1 is a decent real-world estimate, and if I did more work and put more airplanes up here, that would still be a real-world estimate based on years of specific research into this exact question. I'm also putting up here what I'm calling the 6-to-1 bad glider estimate. This is the airplane where somebody's really flying the airplane poorly. They are nowhere close to the optimum speed. You can fly at a slightly non-optimum speed. You should get 9-to-1. You'll get about 8-to-1. That's part of the reason why that's real world. This is the pilot who was nowhere close to the best glide speed. They put the gear down. They left the prop lever forward. They got the cowl flaps out. If you don't know what cowl flaps are, it doesn't matter. The pilot apparently doesn't know either. They got the cowl flaps out and so on. That's kind of about as bad as some kind of piston single is going to glide. Okay. Now, as I said before, manufacturers have alternate ways of kind of expressing those things. So let me give you sort of 3 different ways that we could express these glide ratios. Again, I've got kind of the 9-to-1 best book glide ratio. 8-to-1 is a good real world figure unless something kind of bad's going on. And then 6-to-1 is kind of a bad glide ratio when the pilot's even got the cowl flaps out and got the window open, sticking their hand out trying to get the dang thing slowed down, which is not very bright. Okay, we could express it in terms of distance forward per 1,000 feet of altitude loss. If you want the formula for that, you just take the ratio. So for example, 9-to-1, multiply it by 1,000 because we're doing it per 1,000 feet of altitude loss, divide by 6076 to get it, related to nautical miles. That's the formula. If you want to know what we're going to loosely call the gliding glide slope, if you will. The formula, it's just an inverse trigonometric function, so it's arc sine. You just take the inverse of the ratio. So instead of 8-to-1, you just take 1-to-8, take the arc sine of that ratio, boom, that's going to be your figure. And then if we want to do the feet lost per 1 nautical mile forward, which remember is what I'm going to want controllers to actually observe, not per se calculate. There's just a tiny bit of calculation there. But if you want to get kind of a preview of what that's going to look like, you just take the ratio and you take 6076 divided by the ratio. So for example, 6076 divided by 6. Well, gee, that's going to be right about 1,000, right? 6,000 divided by 6. Okay, so here are some actual numbers. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize these. But basically, here's what I want you to kind of think of. I'm going to grab the laser pointer. We're going to play with the laser. So about 1.5 miles for every 1,000 feet forward, or 1,000 feet above the local terrain, is about as good as you're going to get. Again, there's a few airplanes, if they're flown properly, you're going to eke out something a bit better. And again, we're still talking the piston singles. 1.3 is kind of a real world value. The really bad gliders, they're going to go about 1 mile per 1,000 feet, and that's all they're going to get. They're just not gliding all that great. But again, if you kind of keep in mind this range of about 1 mile to 1.5 miles per 1,000 feet, what that tells us is if somebody's at 10,000 feet, okay, at 10,000 feet, they might go 10 miles. They might go about 13 miles. They might go about 15 miles, and that's 10,000 feet above the local terrain. They're not going to go 40 miles with a total engine failure, people. This airplane might go about 13 pretty comfortably, 15 if they're doing well, but they ain't going 40, okay? Now, in terms of the glide slope, the one and only reason I want you to see these glide slope numbers is because I want to ask you, what is the typical glide slope on an instrument approach? It's 3 degrees. Folks, even the best of these airplanes are coming down a bit more than twice as steep. There is no way in the world that somebody can track a normal instrument approach glide slope with a total engine failure. They're going to come down about twice as steep. And even if somebody is in one of these higher performance gliding type airplanes, they're flying it by the book. They really know what they're doing. And, okay, again, we're talking still air here. They're still going to come down definitely about twice as steep as what the published glide slope is. Finally, this is just a preview of the numbers that we are kind of thinking we're going to observe to give you some kind of sense of what these will be. So again, 9-to-1 glide ratio for every mile as we are tracking it, okay? They're going to do about a little less than 700 feet per nautical mile. Okay, at an 8-to-1 ratio, again, decent real-world value. We're looking at about 700, 800 feet, call it 760 to be official, per 1 nautical mile forward. And the so-called bad gliders are going to do, and we already previewed this number in our heads, right? About 1,000 feet per nautical mile. All right. Because controllers are also interested in how this is going to relate to the speed through the airspeed, and the descent rate. Here are just some sample values of what those will look like, okay? So again, a slower airplane gliding well, we might see descent rates on the order of about 600-ish, 700-ish feet per minute. If you remember that video, that Bonanza out in Seattle. He lost the oil pressure, and so he was not going to glide very well. Okay, if you remember what Scott Purdue said, he's like, yeah, that kind of bonanza, they're going to do about 1,500 feet per minute. What he probably has in mind is probably kind of this number-ish here. That number happens to also be achieved in the bad glider at about 90 knots. I think this particular bonanza in that situation was somewhere about 105 knots in ballpark 7-to-1 ratio if you sit down and do the math. But this just gives you some sense of what you're going to see. So that's kind of that bonanza out in Seattle. This, though, is the number over here I want you to think about. Even though 9-to-1 is slightly optimistic for a lot of airplanes, this is the number we are going to use. And I want you, if we simplify it to one number, I want you to think about a 9-to-1 ratio, and for an airplane doing 90 knots, which is 1.5 miles per minute, that's right about 1,000 feet per minute. That is slightly optimistic for some airplanes, okay? It is what some airplanes will actually achieve. A lot of them are going to come just a little bit short of this. In some cases, they'll end up a lot short, but I want you to assume roughly 1,000 feet per minute, 90 knots. That's that 9-to-1 glide ratio. So if you just want one easy to remember set of numbers, think of that. Definitely keep in mind that if they say it's an oil pressure problem and it's one of these airplanes with a constant speed prop, and I realize you won't know which ones those are, the general rule of thumb, training airplanes are just fixed pitch. They're not going to have that. Once you get into the higher performance airplanes, most of them are constant speed props. Don't forget the Cirrus has the little quirk with the propeller, so they're not going to, doesn't matter if they have oil pressure or not. But a lot of these airplanes, when we go through the math in sample sections of later videos, I'm typically going to do 1,000 feet per minute, 90 knots. That's 1.5 miles a minute, in part because it makes the mental math easy for learning purposes. Feel free to use that in the real world when you want that really quick guess, but then start looking at how the airplane is actually performing. So, all right, Ken, we heard what you said in the interview. We are going to train the basics on this. Please don't page me. I'm eating a sandwich. Thank you.